It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Daniel Sterling laughed as he poured the red wine over Amelia Vance's dress in front of the entire table. The liquid was a deep, bruising crimson, spreading across the cream-colored silk of her vintage slip dress like an expanding wound. It happened in slow motion, the tilt of the crystal glass, the glint of the chandelier light in the cabernet, and the sharp, metallic scent of the alcohol hitting the air. The restaurant, a 3-Michelin-star establishment called the Gilded Lily, was hushed, the kind of place where even the clink of a fork felt like a transgression. Now, the only sound was the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the wine falling from the hem of her skirt onto the white marble floor. "Oh, Amelia," Daniel said, his voice pitched in that specific tone of performative concern he saved for public audiences. He didn't pull back. Instead, he watched the last few drops fall with a look of mild amusement. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was just gesturing toward the breadbasket and my hand slipped. You know how clumsy I get when I'm excited about our future." He didn't offer a napkin. He didn't reach out to help. He simply sat back in his velvet-backed chair, adjusting his Rolex with a flick of his wrist. "It's fine," Amelia said. Her voice was a flat, calm line. She didn't jump up. She didn't gasp. She sat perfectly still, feeling the cold moisture seep through the delicate fabric and cling to her skin. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic thrum in her throat, but her hands, hidden beneath the table, were locked into white-knuckled fists. "Is it fine, though?" Eleanor Sterling asked, leaning forward. Daniel's mother was a woman who wore her pearls like armor and her retired therapist's license like a weapon. She reached across the table, not to touch Amelia's hand, but to pat the air near it. "Amelia, dear, your energy feels very reactive right now. I can see the tension in your jaw. It's important for the family dynamic that we address these little accidents with grace, rather than internalizing them as slights." "It was just a dress, Eleanor," Amelia replied, her eyes meeting the older woman's. "A budget dress, clearly," Emily Thorne chimed in from Daniel's left. The ex-girlfriend who had never quite left the inner circle sat there like a poisonous flower, her eyes darting between Daniel and the stain. She sipped her sparkling water, a small, triumphant smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I mean, the silk is so thin. Real mulberry silk wouldn't have absorbed the pigment that quickly." "Perhaps it's a blessing in disguise. You really can't show up to the engagement party in something that looks like it came from a clearance rack." Daniel chuckled, a low, vibrating sound that made Amelia's skin crawl. "Emily has a point, babe. I've been telling you that we need to upgrade your wardrobe. If you're going to be a Sterling, you have to look the part. You're representing my brand now. My firm is up for the city's urban renewal project, and image is everything." Amelia looked at him, the man she had supported through 3 years of late-night drafting sessions, the man whose student loans she had quietly paid off through a grant she'd funneled through her own project management firm, the man who currently thought he was the sun, and she was a lucky planet caught in his gravity. "Representing your brand," she repeated softly. "Exactly," Daniel said, his eyes already wandering to his phone as it buzzed on the table. "Anyway, I've already decided. We're going to need you to sign over the title of that coastal property your father gave you, the one in Grays Harbor. My firm needs the collateral to secure the final bond for the city project. It's a small sacrifice for our collective success." The audacity of the demand hung in the air, heavier than the scent of the wine. The Grays Harbor property wasn't just land. It was her father's legacy, the site where Robert Vance had built his first workshop. It was the only thing Amelia had kept entirely separate from the Sterling family's reach. "The harbor property isn't part of the wedding discussions, Daniel," Amelia said. Eleanor sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "There it is again, that mine and yours mentality. Amelia, marriage is a merger of souls and assets. Holding on to that dusty old lot is just a symptom of your fear of intimacy. If you truly loved my son, you'd want to be the wind beneath his wings, not the anchor dragging him down." Amelia felt the familiar prickle of rage, but she leaned into it, using the heat to sharpen her focus. She reached for her clutch, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard edge of her work phone. She felt the weight of the black titanium card tucked inside her wallet, a card that didn't belong to a budget project manager, but to the majority shareholder of Vance Holdings. "I need to go to the ladies' room," Amelia said, standing up. "Don't be long," Daniel said without looking up from his screen. "The main course is coming, and I don't want to have to explain to the waiter why my fiancé is dripping on the carpet." Amelia walked away from the table, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble. She didn't head for the restrooms. She turned a corner into the shadowed hallway that led toward the kitchen and the private offices. She pulled out her phone and hit a speed dial contact. "Cynthia," she said when the line picked up. "I'm here, Amelia. Is it happening?" The wedding planner's voice was crisp, professional, and tinged with a secret excitement. "The accident just happened," Amelia said, looking at the red stain on her hip. "Daniel just asked for the harbor property, in front of his mother and Emily." "The entitlement is staggering," Cynthia whispered. "Are we proceeding with the audit?" "Not just the audit," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a cold, crystalline whisper. "I want a full clawback on the Sterling Urban Development account. Every cent I funneled into his firm's operating costs over the last 18 months. If the signatures on those grant documents are contested, remind them that I have the original promissory notes." "And Cynthia?" "Yes. Call the caterers for the engagement party. Tell them the budget has been revised to 0, but don't cancel the date. I want the venue held." "Understood. And the Sterling Estates line of credit." Amelia looked back toward the dining room, where she could see the back of Daniel's head. He was leaning close to Emily, whispering something that made her laugh. Eleanor was watching them with a beatific smile, the picture of a proud matriarch. "Freeze it," Amelia said. "They think they're dining on my dime tonight. Let's see how Daniel's brand handles a declined card in a room full of his peers." She hung up and took a deep breath, smoothing the stained silk over her hip. She felt a strange, intoxicating sense of lightness. For years, she had played the role of the quiet, supportive partner, the sleeping lion who kept her claws retracted to avoid scratching the fragile ego of the man she thought she loved. But the wine had washed away the last of her illusions. She walked back to the table. The main course had arrived, 4 plates of seared Wagyu beef that cost more than most people made in a week. "There she is," Daniel said, gesturing vaguely to her chair. "You missed the presentation. The chef came out personally. He's a fan of my work on the downtown plaza." Amelia sat down, her movements fluid and graceful. She picked up her fork and took a small, deliberate bite of the steak. It tasted like nothing. "So, about the deed," Daniel said, his mouth full of expensive beef. "I'll have my lawyer drop the paperwork off at your office tomorrow. Just sign it and get it back to me by noon. We're on a tight schedule." Amelia smiled. It was a small, sharp movement of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. A tight schedule. "Yes, I imagine things are going to start moving very quickly now, Daniel." "That's the spirit," Eleanor said, beaming. "See, a little bit of perspective goes a long way. I knew you'd see reason once you processed your initial resistance." Emily leaned in, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "And don't worry about the dress, Amelia. I have a few things from last season I was going to donate to charity. I'm sure I can find something that fits your aesthetic." Amelia didn't blink. She reached for her wine glass, the fresh one the waiter had brought, and raised it in a silent toast. "To the future," she said. "To the future," they chorused, glasses clinking in the center of the table. Amelia watched Daniel take a deep gulp of his wine, his throat moving as he swallowed. He looked so confident, so utterly certain of his place in the world. He had no idea that the floor beneath his feet was already beginning to dissolve. He didn't know that the firm he bragged about was a hollow shell, held together by the very woman he had just humiliated. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a text from Cynthia, credit lines frozen, audit initiated, the lion is awake. Amelia tucked the phone away. She looked at the red stain on her dress, no longer seeing a mark of shame but a declaration of war. "Oh, Daniel," she said, her voice soft and dangerously sweet. I almost forgot. I have a little surprise for you, something to celebrate the merger of our assets. Daniel perked up, his eyes widening with greed. Yeah, what is it? Amelia leaned forward, the light of the chandelier catching the cold, hard depths of her eyes. You'll find out when the bill comes. Amelia sat perfectly still, the damp silk of her dress clinging to her skin like a cold, red second skin. Across the table, Daniel took another slow, satisfied sip of the Cabernet, his eyes tracking the movement of a waiter as if he already owned the restaurant. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, his gaze landing on the shimmering skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling estate. He was in his element here, surrounded by the heavy scent of beeswax, old leather, and the suffocating weight of his family's self-importance. You really should work on that clumsiness, Amelia, Eleanor Sterling said, her voice a practiced melody of clinical concern. She adjusted a heavy gold bracelet on her wrist, the metal clinking against her watch with a sharp, rhythmic sound. It's a manifestation of internal resistance. Perhaps you're feeling overwhelmed by the scale of the merger. It's a lot for someone from your background to process. Amelia felt the familiar prickle of heat behind her eyes, but she didn't blink. She watched Eleanor, a woman who had spent 30 years weaponizing psychology to ensure her son never had to face a single consequence. The woman was an artist of the subtle jab, painting Amelia's very existence as a series of pathological failures. I'm quite all right, Eleanor, Amelia replied, her voice level. Accidents happen, though I find that some things are much harder to clean up than wine. Daniel chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. He leaned forward, the candlelight catching the sharp angles of his face. Don't be so dramatic, it's just a dress. I'll have Emily take you shopping tomorrow. She has a much better eye for what suits our public image anyway. You tend to lean toward the understated. The mention of Emily Thorne was a calculated strike. Daniel's ex-girlfriend wasn't just a guest at their upcoming wedding. She was a permanent fixture, a dear friend, who Daniel insisted on keeping close for the sake of his emotional equilibrium. Amelia saw the way Emily watched them from the far end of the table, her smile thin and knowing. Emily was dressed in a gown that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, a gift Daniel had likely charged to a credit line he assumed was still active. Amelia reached into her clutch, her fingers brushing the cool, embossed surface of a black titanium card. It was a secondary account, one Daniel didn't know existed, the one that actually funded the lifestyle he flaunted. She felt a surge of cold, quiet power. He was sitting there, demeaning her father's simple construction business, unaware that the very chair he sat in was technically her property. Actually, Daniel, I think I'll handle my own shopping, Amelia said. She felt the vibration of her phone in her lap. A second text from Cynthia, phase 2 complete. The vendor contracts have been moved to your personal holding company. He's flying blind. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. Suit yourself, but use the joint account. I want the statement to look consistent for the accountants. We have a reputation to maintain before the Unity Gala on Friday. The gala, Amelia repeated. 3 days away. The pinnacle of the Sterling legacy, Eleanor added, her eyes shining with a predatory sort of pride. The night the world sees what this family is truly capable of. Amelia stood up, the red stain on her dress now a dark, bruised purple under the chandelier light. I think I've had enough for one evening. I'm going to see my father. Daniel's expression shifted instantly. The mask of refined urban planner slipped, revealing the jagged edge of his entitlement. Your father, again. Amelia, we've talked about this. Your constant need to retreat to that environment is a regression. It's a trauma response to the growth I'm trying to facilitate in you. He's my father, Daniel. He's also the man who built half the foundations in this city. And he's a man who smells of sawdust and cheap beer, Daniel snapped, his voice rising just enough to make the guests at the nearby table glance over. He's a distraction. You're marrying a Sterling. It's time you started acting like you understand the elevation that requires. The room went silent. Eleanor nodded approvingly at her son's firmness. Emily Thorne suppressed a giggle behind a manicured hand. Amelia looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the hollow shell she had been trying to fill with her own substance for 3 years. "I understand perfectly," Amelia said softly. She walked out of the dining room, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown. She didn't wait for the valet. She walked to the edge of the driveway where her modest SUV was parked, a stark contrast to the fleet of Italian sports cars lining the curb. As she pulled away, she saw Daniel in the rearview mirror, standing on the portico, already back on his phone, likely ordering another bottle of something he couldn't afford. 20 minutes later, she pulled into the gravel drive of a small, immaculate brick house on the outskirts of the city. The smell of cedar and motor oil greeted her before she even reached the door. Robert Vance was sitting on the porch, a blueprint spread across his lap, a single lamp casting a warm glow over his weathered hands. He didn't ask about the stain. He didn't ask why she was trembling. He just stood up and opened the door. "The audit is done, Mia," Robert said, his voice a low rumble of steady earth. He handed her a thick manila envelope. "You were right. He's been siphoning the project funds into Emily's consulting firm for 18 months. He thought because the Sterling name was on the masthead, no one would look at the ledger." Amelia opened the envelope. She looked at the signatures, Daniel's arrogant, looping scrawl on documents that authorized the transfer of millions. Her millions. The money her mother had left her, the inheritance she had tucked away into the firm to help Daniel realize his vision. "He calls it emotional labor compensation in the internal notes," Robert added, his jaw tightening. "He thinks he's entitled to your soul and your bank account." Amelia ran her thumb over a bank statement. "He told me tonight that I don't belong in his world. He told me I was a regression. He's a parasite, Mia. Parasites always hate the host once they realize they can't drain it dry anymore." Amelia looked back toward the city lights, toward the Sterling estate where the Unity Gala would take place in 72 hours. She thought of the hundreds of guests, the press, the investors who believed Daniel Sterling was a genius of urban development. "He wants a merger," Amelia whispered, a cold smile finally touching her lips. "I think it's time we gave him a full liquidation instead." She pulled out her phone and dialed Cynthia. The wedding planner answered on the first ring. "Cynthia," Amelia said, her voice devoid of the hesitation that had defined her for years. "The florist called about the centerpieces for the gala. They wanted to know if we should go with the sterling white or something more dramatic." "And what did you tell them?" Cynthia asked. "Tell them to prepare for a funeral," Amelia said, "and make sure the press has front row seats. I want everyone to see exactly what happens when a sterling tries to build on a foundation they didn't earn." She hung up and looked at her father. Robert reached out and squeezed her shoulder, his hand a solid, unmoving weight. "Are you ready, Mia?" Amelia looked down at the red stain on her dress. It wasn't a mark of shame anymore. It was the first drop of a coming storm. "I've been ready for 3 years, Dad. He just didn't realize who he was actually inviting into his house." She turned back to the blueprints on the table. They weren't for a building. They were the financial schematics of a total collapse. As the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, signaling the start of the final 72 hours, Amelia Vance picked up a red pen and began to cross out the Sterling name, one line at a time. The phone on the table began to buzz. It was Daniel. He was calling to demand she return home and apologize to his mother. Amelia watched the screen glow in the dark, the name Daniel flickering like a dying spark. She didn't answer. She simply turned the phone face down, leaving him in the silence of a world that was already, brick by brick, ceasing to be his. The heavy scent of fresh printer toner and old mahogany filled the small back office of the Vance construction firm. It was a smell that usually brought Amelia Vance a sense of order, but today, it felt like the sharpening of a blade. She sat across from her father, Robert, and Cynthia, the wedding planner who had quietly become her most effective double agent. On the desk between them lay a thick, manila folder. It didn't look like a weapon of mass destruction, but within its pages were the signed receipts, the credit line transfers, and the audit of the Sterling family trusts. For 3 years, Daniel had treated her income as a communal pool while guarding his own family's assets like a dragon on a hoard. He didn't realize that by helping him manage the family's upcoming merger and the wedding expenses, Amelia had gained access to the very foundations of his ego. "They're overextended," Cynthia said, her voice low and sharp. She tapped a manicured nail against a spreadsheet. Alina insisted on the hand-painted silk drapes for the ballroom and the vintage crystal for the toast. She signed for them using the corporate account, assuming you'd cover the balance next week as usual. But the corporate account is tied to the estate collateral. Amelia traced the edge of the folder. The paper felt rough, a grounding contrast to the silk-lined world she was about to tear down. She looked at her father. Robert Vance didn't say much. He didn't have to. He had spent 40 years building things with his hands, and he knew exactly how much pressure it took to make a structure collapse. "The deed to the lake house is in there too," her father said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The one Daniel told you was a family legacy you weren't allowed to put your name on. It turns out the legacy was built on a series of predatory loans he took out in his mother's name to fund his failed urban development startup. He's been using your salary to pay the interest, Mia." Amelia felt a cold, familiar spark in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was the clinical satisfaction of a project manager, seeing the final piece of a complex puzzle click into place. "So, if the interest isn't paid by Friday..." "The bank moves in," Cynthia replied with a ghost of a smile. "And since I've redirected the wedding vendor payments to the escrow account you controlled, the sterling wedding of the century is currently sitting on a debt of $300,000, due the moment the first bottle is uncorked." Amelia closed the folder. The sound was as final as a gavel. 48 hours. Let's make sure they're the most expensive 48 hours of his life. The transition from the quiet office to the opulence of the Sterling Hall was jarring. The venue was a temple of glass and gold, currently crawling with florists and caterers. Amelia stepped onto the marble floor, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She saw them near the altar, a trio of entitlement framed by $10,000 floral arrangements. Daniel was gesturing grandly to a decorator, his voice carrying that tone of casual authority he used when he was spending money he hadn't earned. Alina stood beside him, her posture regal and rigid, while Emily Thorne hovered at his shoulder like a devoted shadow, nodding at every word he spoke. "It needs to be more aspirational," Daniel said, not looking up as Amelia approached. "The peonies look a bit limp." "We're hosting the VIPs of the tri-state area, not a garden party for the help." "The peonies are fresh, Daniel," Amelia said, her voice level and cool. He turned, his expression shifting from irritation to a practiced, condescending mask of concern. He didn't apologize for his frantic, demanding calls from the night before. Instead, he stepped toward her, invading her personal space with the smell of expensive sandalwood and unearned confidence. "Amelia, darling, there you are," he said, reaching out to touch her arm. She stepped back just enough to make him miss, a subtle movement that made his eyes flicker with a momentary flash of annoyance. "You didn't answer your phone. My mother was quite distressed. We had to make several executive decisions without you." "I can imagine," she replied, glancing at Alina. The older woman stepped forward, her face a masterpiece of passive-aggressive concern. She reached into her Chanel bag and pulled out a small vial of lavender oil, dabbing it on her wrists as if the very air Amelia breathed was a pollutant. "Amelia, we really need to discuss your father's seating," Alina said, her voice dripping with the therapeutic faux kindness she used to weaponize her insults. "We've moved him to table 14. It's near the back, closer to the exit. We felt he'd be more comfortable there, away from the higher-intensity conversations. He might feel a bit out of his depth with the Sterling board members." Amelia felt the rage spike in her throat, hot and metallic. She thought of her father's calloused hands, the hands that had paid for Daniel's first office lease when his vision didn't include a business plan. "Table 14, Amelia repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "It's for the best, really," Emily chimed in, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She moved closer to Daniel, her hand brushing his sleeve in a way that was meant to be seen. "We want the head table to reflect a certain aesthetic. Daniel needs to look the part of the new CEO, and your father's presence might raise questions about the family's pedigree that we just don't have time to answer right now." Daniel chuckled, a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Don't be so sensitive, Mia. It's about branding. You understand branding, don't you? It's why I've decided we're going to announce the merger during the toast. It'll be the perfect, sterling moment. By the way, I need you to transfer the final payment for the catering by 5 today. They're being a bit pushy about the balance." Amelia looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the way he adjusted his Rolex, a gift she had bought him for an anniversary he'd forgotten. She saw the way he looked at the hall as if he owned the air within it, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath his feet was already beginning to crack. "The catering," Amelia said, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Of course, I'll make sure everything is settled." "Good girl," Daniel said, dismissing her with a pat on the shoulder that felt like a brand. He turned back to Emily and his mother. "Now, about the ice sculpture. I want it larger. I want people to feel the cold the moment they walk in." Amelia watched them for a moment, the enabler, the parasite, and the bully. They were so blinded by their own reflected glory that they couldn't see the shadow she was casting. She reached into her purse and felt the edge of the manila folder she had brought with her. She wasn't going to give it to him. Not yet. She walked toward the exit, but stopped near the massive crystal chandelier that hung over the dance floor. The light fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces across the marble. "Daniel," she called out. He turned, looking impatient. "What now, Amelia?" "I hope you've practiced your speech," she said, her voice carrying across the empty hall, drawing the attention of 2 florists and the head caterer. "I'd hate for you to be caught without the right words when the lights finally go out." Daniel frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means that enlightenment often comes at a very high cost," she said, her tone as pleasant as a death sentence. "And I think you're about to find out exactly how much you can't afford." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't need to. She walked out of the hall, the sound of her heels echoing like a countdown. Behind her, she heard Aliner's sharp, indignant voice asking Daniel what was wrong with her, and Emily's soft, cooing attempts to soothe his ego. Outside, the cool evening air hit her face, smelling of rain and coming storms. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Cynthia. Phase 1 complete. Release the first Leon notice at 9:00 a.m. Amelia climbed into her car, the silence of the interior a sanctuary. She looked at the dashboard clock. 48 hours until the wedding. 48 hours until Daniel Sterling tried to stand at the head of a table that no longer existed. As she pulled away from the curb, she saw Daniel through the glass doors of the hall, gesturing wildly at a worker, his mouth moving in a silent tantrum of entitlement. He looked so small inside that massive, expensive cage. He had spent his whole life thinking he was the master of the house, never realizing that Amelia Vance was the one who held the keys, the deed, and the match. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. And as the first drop of rain hit her windshield, Amelia realized she had never felt more at peace. The cost of his enlightenment was going to be everything he owned, and she was going to enjoy every second of the collection. The scent of lemon-scented floor wax and oversteeped Earl Grey hung heavy in the foyer of the Sterling estate. It was a smell that usually commanded respect, a sensory reminder of generations of supposed refinement, but to Amelia, it now smelled like a decaying museum. She stood by the mahogany banister, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. The wood felt cold, stripped of the warmth she once thought it held. In the center of the great hall, Daniel Sterling was in his element. He was gesturing expansively toward the vaulted ceiling, while a photographer from the local Society Gazette snapped photos. He wore a navy blazer that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his posture radiating the casual, unearned confidence of a man who believed the ground rose up to meet his feet simply because he was a Sterling. "We've always viewed this house as the anchor of the community," he said, his voice carrying that practiced, melodic tone he used when he wanted to sound profound. My grandfather built this foundation on the idea of stability. In an ever-changing world, the sterling name remains the one thing people can count on. Amelia watched him from the shadows of the hallway. The audacity of his words was a physical weight in the room. He spoke of foundations and stability, while the very ground beneath his designer loafers had already been liquidated. She felt the heavy, rectangular shape of her phone in her pocket, containing the digital confirmation that the first wave of lien notices had been served to the Sterling family lawyers less than an hour ago. "Amelia, darling, don't just lurk in the corners," Eleanor Sterling said, appearing at her side with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She adjusted a pearl necklace that looked like a leash. "It's a bit unsettling for the guests. You should be out there supporting Daniel. This feature is very important for his image before the wedding. We need to project a unified front of prosperity." "Prosperity is easy to project when you're standing in a house someone else paid for," she replied, her voice low and steady. Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossing her face before she smoothed it over with a patronizing pat on Amelia's arm. "I understand you're feeling some pre-wedding anxiety, dear. It's a lot of pressure for someone from your background to step into a legacy this significant. I've told Daniel we should perhaps increase your sessions with the family therapist. You're clearly struggling to process the magnitude of the gift you're receiving by joining this family." The gaslighting was so effortless it was almost impressive. Amelia didn't pull away. She simply looked at the older woman, noting the way the sunlight hit the fine lines around her mouth. "I'm processing things just fine, Eleanor. I'm actually quite focused on the concept of gifts and how quickly they can be reclaimed." Before Eleanor could weaponize another psychological platitude, Daniel marched over, his face flushed with the high of his own performance. Emily Thorne trailed behind him, clutching a tablet and looking like a vulture in a floral dress. "The photographer wants a shot of us in the library," Daniel said, not asking but commanding. He didn't look at Amelia. He looked at the space just above her head, as if she were a prop that needed to be moved into position. "And Emily needs you to sign off on the additional floral budget. She decided the foyer needs 10 more arrangements of white lilies. It's an extra 8,000, but we can't have the place looking sparse." "8,000 for lilies that will be dead by Monday?" Amelia asked. Emily sighed, a sound of exaggerated exhaustion. "It's not just flowers, Amelia. It's about the aesthetic experience. Daniel's family has a reputation to uphold. I know you're used to being frugal, but this is a sterling event. Try not to let your small-mindedness ruin the atmosphere." "I'm not worried about the atmosphere, Emily," she said, turning her gaze to Daniel. "I'm worried about the structural integrity of this plan. Daniel, have you checked the mail today? Or perhaps spoken to your father's accountants?" Daniel let out a sharp, derisive laugh. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate but felt like a claim of ownership. "Always so literal, Amelia. This is why I handle the big picture and you handle the, well, whatever it is you do. Don't worry your head about the accountants. The Sterling estate is a fortress. What could you possibly know about our finances that I do?" "More than you'd think," she murmured. "Ownership is a fragile thing, Daniel. It's not about whose name is carved into the stone over the door. It's about who holds the paper in the vault." He rolled his eyes, turning back toward the photographer. "Spoken like someone who's never owned anything more than a lease. Come on, we're losing the light." As they moved toward the library, Cynthia, the wedding planner, stepped out from behind a large marble bust. She held a clipboard, her expression unreadable to anyone but Amelia. They had spent the last 6 months in a delicate dance of hidden ledgers and redirected payments. Cynthia had been the one to ensure that every sterling deposit was actually backed by Amelia's personal holding company. Cynthia caught her eye and gave a single, microscopic nod, the witness to the delusion. She had watched Daniel treat the staff like furniture for months, and the look in her eyes now was one of grim anticipation. "The catering staff is asking about the final payment for the champagne tower," Cynthia said, her voice loud enough to catch Daniel's ear. "Just put it on the house account." Daniel snapped over his shoulder, not even pausing his stride. Honestly, why am I being bothered with these trivialities? We have a legacy to celebrate. Amelia watched them go, the sound of Daniel's heavy loafers echoing on the hardwood. He was so blinded by the glare of his own reflection that he couldn't see the shadows closing in. He truly believed that the world owed him this stage, that the walls of this house would protect him from the consequences of his own arrogance. She walked to the large front doors and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler here, smelling of damp earth and the coming storm. Her father, Robert Vance, was standing by the edge of the driveway, his old truck parked a respectful distance from the line of luxury SUVs. He was talking to one of the gardeners, his posture relaxed, his hands calloused and honest. Daniel had once suggested that Robert should enter through the service entrance during the wedding so as not to confuse the guests with his aesthetic. Amelia felt a cold, sharp spark of clarity. She pulled her phone from her pocket and swiped through the latest updates from her legal team. The Sterling's primary credit line had been frozen 5 minutes ago. The house account Daniel was so fond of was now a black hole. She looked up at the grand facade of the estate. To the world, it looked like a monument to wealth. To her, it looked like a house of cards in a rising wind. Inside, she could hear the faint sound of Daniel laughing, a boisterous, entitled sound that filled the halls he no longer owned. He was still playing the part of the master, unaware that the audience had already left and the lights were about to go dark. 24 hours, Daniel, she whispered to the empty air. She watched a single leaf drift down from a massive oak tree, landing on the hood of Daniel's car. It was the first sign of the season's change. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, the Sterling legacy wouldn't just be challenged. It would be extinct. And as she watched her father wave to her from the driveway, Amelia realized that the most satisfying part of the trap wasn't that she had set it. It was that Daniel had walked into it while bragging about how much he liked the view. She turned and walked back inside, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic countdown on the marble floor. The delusion of ownership was a powerful thing, but it was nothing compared to the reality of the debt. And tomorrow, Amelia Vance was coming to collect. The scent of lilies and expensive beeswax candles always felt like a funeral to Amelia Vance. Tonight, as she stepped into the Sterling estate for the final rehearsal dinner, the floral cloy was suffocating. The grand foyer was a cathedral of curated ego, the walls lined with portraits of men who had built their legacies on the backs of better people. Amelia smoothed the silk of her dress, her fingers brushing the small, hard rectangle of the digital recorder tucked into her clutch. She wasn't the lamb at this altar anymore. She was the architect of the demolition. Daniel Sterling stood at the center of the room, his laughter a practiced, melodic sound that didn't reach his eyes. He was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, gesturing with a casual arrogance that suggested he owned the very air the guests were breathing. Beside him, Emily Thorne hovered like a well-dressed shadow, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. She wore a necklace that Amelia recognized instantly, a delicate sapphire pendant that had belonged to Amelia's grandmother. Daniel had told her it was being cleaned and appraised for insurance purposes. Seeing it around Emily's neck felt like a physical blow, a sharp, cold spike of rage that Amelia transformed into a calm, icy resolve. "Amelia, darling, you finally made it," Eleanor Sterling said, gliding toward her with the predatory grace of a swan. She didn't offer a hug, she offered a critical scan of Amelia's attire. A bit understated for the final evening, isn't it? But then, I suppose we can't all possess the Sterling flair for the dramatic. Amelia offered a thin, practiced smile. "I find that the most important things don't need to scream to be heard, Eleanor." "How?" "Quaint," Eleanor replied, her voice dripping with the faux sympathy she usually reserved for her therapy clients. "We were just discussing the seating chart for tomorrow. Daniel feels it's best if your father is seated at the back. We wouldn't want him to feel overwhelmed by the how shall I put this, the social complexity of our circle. Robert is such a simple man, after all." The insult was calculated, a jagged little stone thrown to see if Amelia would ripple. Amelia caught her father's eye across the room. Robert Vance was standing near the fireplace, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly but felt like a cage. He gave her a subtle, knowing nod. He knew the debt was being called in. He knew the simple man was about to watch the complex dynasty crumble. "My father is comfortable exactly where he is, Alina," Amelia said softly. "In fact, I think he's going to have the best view in the house tomorrow." The dining room was a masterclass in performative wealth. The table was a sea of bone china and heavy silver that caught the light of the chandeliers, reflecting 1,000 tiny, fractured sparks. As the guests took their seats, Daniel took his place at the head of the table. He leaned back, his posture radiating a sense of absolute dominion. To his right sat Emily, and to his left, the empty chair he had deigned to give Amelia. "Amelia," Daniel said, his voice carrying easily over the clink of silverware. "I was just telling Arthur and Margaret about our plans for the Vance property. I've decided we're going to level the old barn and the orchard. It's a bit of an eyesore, really. We'll put in a modern guest wing and a tennis court. It's about elevating the space, you understand, moving it into the 21st century." The table went quiet. Margaret and Robert Vance, the elder Sterling's cousins, not Amelia's father, nodded in approval, their faces masks of polite indifference to the destruction of a 100-year-old heritage. Amelia felt the cold condensation on her water glass. "The orchard has been in my family for 4 generations, Daniel. It's not an eyesore, it's a legacy." Daniel sighed, a sound of patronizing exhaustion. "Amelia, we've talked about this. Your attachment to the past is..." "Well, it's a bit of a developmental hurdle, isn't it? As your future husband, I have to think about our brand. The Sterling-Vance union needs to reflect a certain standard. And let's be honest, that land is the only thing of real value you're bringing to the table. It's my job to make it profitable." "Your job?" Amelia asked, her voice steady. "He's only trying to help you, dear," Emily Thorne interjected, her voice a saccharine trill. "Daniel has such a vision for these things. You should be grateful he's willing to put in the work to fix your family's mistakes." Rage spiked again, hot and sharp, but Amelia suppressed it. She reached into her clutch, her thumb grazing the play button on the device, though she didn't press it yet. She looked at Cynthia, the wedding planner, who was standing near the sideboard. Cynthia caught her gaze and gave a microscopic nod. The financial transfers were blocked. The vision Daniel had for the property was built on a foundation of sand that was already beginning to wash away. "I suppose you're right, Daniel," Amelia said, her voice sounding appropriately defeated to his ears. "You always did have a way of taking what belongs to others and making it your own." Daniel smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. "That's the Sterling way, Amelia. We don't just survive, we dominate." The meal proceeded with a calculated cruelty. Alina spent the second course, coaching Amelia on the proper way to address the board members who would be at the wedding, implying that Amelia's current vocabulary was insufficient for the task. Daniel spent the third course bragging about a new development deal he had signed, unaware that the lead investor on that deal was a shell company owned entirely by Amelia Vance. "It's a $20 million play," Daniel boasted, his chest puffed out. "The investors were practically begging to get in. They see the Sterling name and they know it's a sure thing. I've already moved the initial capital into the wedding fund and the property renovations. We're going to start the demolition on the Vance orchard Monday morning." Amelia took a slow sip of her wine. The liquid was tart, tasting of oak and hidden things. "Monday morning," she repeated. "That's a very specific deadline." "In business, Amelia, timing is everything," Daniel said, looking at his gold watch. "Speaking of timing, I think it's time for a little pre-wedding gift. Mother." Alina signaled to a server, who brought out a heavy, velvet-lined tray. On it sat a stack of legal documents. "Since we're all family here," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the room to ensure he had the full attention of his witnesses, "I thought we'd take care of the final paperwork tonight. It's just a standard post-nuptial adjustment, Amelia. Given the, shall we say, imbalance of our respective portfolios, it's only fair that the Sterling assets remain protected. It also gives me power of attorney over the Vance estate to streamline those renovations we discussed. It's for your own protection, really. You've never been good with numbers. He slid the documents across the table toward her. A pen followed, heavy and gold. The room went silent, the only sound the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. All eyes were on her. Eleanor's gaze was expectant, Emily's was smug, and Daniel's was a dare. Amelia looked down at the papers. The language was predatory, designed to strip her of every legal right to her own name and property the moment the I do's were spoken. It was the final piece of the trap he had set for her. She didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she looked at Daniel, really looked at him, seeing the hollow, desperate vanity that drove every move he made. He thought he was the master of the board, but he hadn't even realized the game had changed. "You want me to sign this now?" Amelia asked. "No time like the present," Daniel said, his voice dropping into that soothing, gaslighting tone he used to control her. "It's the mature thing to do, Amelia. Unless you're having those emotional outbursts again, we wouldn't want to ruin the evening with a scene." Amelia felt the weight of the digital recorder in her purse. She felt the knowledge of the frozen accounts, the authenticated deeds, and the mountain of evidence sitting in her lawyer's inbox. She looked at her father, who was watching her with a quiet, fierce pride. "I'm not having an outburst, Daniel," Amelia said, her voice as cold as the marble floor beneath them. "I'm having a realization." "And what's that, darling?" Eleanor asked, her voice laced with boredom. "That the Sterling name isn't quite as stable as you think it is." Daniel laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Is that so? And what would a project manager from a failing farm know about stability? My family built this city, Amelia. You're just a guest in it." "Amelia, please," Emily said, reaching for the pen. "Don't be difficult. You're lucky to even be at this table. Just sign the papers so we can get to the toast." Amelia stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and possessed a sudden, sharp authority that cut through the room's atmosphere. She didn't look at the papers. She looked at the room, the witnesses, the enablers, the architect of her misery. "I think I've had enough of the Sterling hospitality for one night," Amelia said. Daniel's face darkened, the mask of the charming groom-to-be slipping to reveal the bully underneath. "Sit down, Amelia. You're making a fool of yourself. We have guests. You will sign those papers, and you will do it now." "Or what, Daniel?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to command the entire room. "You'll cut me off. You'll take away the protection of your name. The name that's currently being investigated for 3 separate counts of embezzlement in the very development deal you were just bragging about." The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel's face went from a flush of anger to a sudden, sickly pale. Eleanor's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "You don't know what you're talking about," Daniel hissed, his eyes darting to the guests. "You're delusional." "We'll see who's delusional tomorrow," Amelia said. She turned to her father. "Dad, I think it's time to go. We have a big day ahead of us." Robert Vance stood up, his presence suddenly looming large in the opulent room. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to his daughter's side. Amelia looked back at Daniel, who was still sitting at the head of the table, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his glass. He tried to reclaim his posture, tried to project the image of the man in control, but the cracks were there. The air in the room had changed. The hunters were starting to feel like prey. "Enjoy the dinner, Daniel," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear as she leaned over the table. "Eat well, because tomorrow, when the sun goes down, you're going to be very, very hungry." She turned and walked out of the dining room, the click of her heels on the marble floor sounding like the steady, inevitable beat of a drum. She didn't look back at the stunned faces or the heavy silver or the sapphire pendant around a thief's neck. She walked out of the mansion and into the cool night air, where Cynthia was waiting by the car. "Is it done?" Cynthia asked. Amelia looked at the dark silhouette of the Sterling estate, the lights inside flickering like a dying fire. "The stage is set, Cynthia. All the witnesses are in place. And Daniel." Amelia reached into her clutch and pulled out the recorder. She pressed a button, and Daniel's voice filled the car, arrogant, entitled, and admitting to every financial crime he had committed in his pursuit of the Vance land. "Daniel is exactly where I want him," Amelia said, her voice steady and cold. "He's at the head of the table, convinced he's won. He has no idea the house is already empty." She got into the car and closed the door. As they pulled away, she looked at her watch. 12 hours until the wedding. 12 hours until the Sterling legacy became a ghost story. The countdown hadn't just reached 0, it had started the explosion. And as the mansion faded into the distance, Amelia Vance finally felt the weight of the funeral lift, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of the coming storm. Amelia Vance smoothed the lapel of her midnight blue blazer, the silk cool against her fingertips. She stood at the back of the St. Regis ballroom, a sharp contrast to the sea of frothy pastels and rented tuxedos. The scent of 5,000 white lilies hung heavy in the air, cloying and thick, more like a funeral parlor than a wedding. The string quartet was halfway through a pretentious arrangement of Vivaldi, the high notes scraping against the marble walls like a warning. "Amelia, what on earth are you wearing?" She didn't need to turn to recognize the sharp, clinical tone. Eleanor Sterling stood there, draped in champagne-colored lace that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She looked Amelia up and down with the practiced disdain of a woman who weaponized etiquette. "You were supposed to be in the sage green chiffon with the other bridesmaids," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You're ruining the color palette of the professional photos, but I suppose we should have expected a lack of decorum from your side of the family. Some people simply cannot be coached into class, no matter how much we try to help them." Amelia offered a thin, tight smile. "I think you'll find this suit is much more appropriate for the business at hand, Eleanor." "Business? This is a wedding." "The union of two legacies." Eleanor stepped closer, the smell of her expensive, musky perfume invading Amelia's space. "Try to keep your mouth shut and stay in the back. Daniel is already stressed enough about the Vance land transfer. Don't make this more difficult than your presence already is." Amelia watched her walk away, her heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant beat on the polished floor. That was the first spike of the morning, the casual dismissal of a human being as a mere aesthetic blot. Amelia reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the flash drive. A few feet away, Cynthia caught her eye. The wedding planner was holding a tablet, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but she gave a single, sharp nod. The tech booth was secure. The music shifted. The heavy oak doors at the front of the hall groaned open. Daniel Sterling stood at the altar, looking every bit the golden boy in his custom charcoal suit. He adjusted his cufflinks, the ones Amelia had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, and scanned the room with a smirk. When his gaze landed on Amelia at the back, he didn't look guilty. He looked triumphant. He offered her a slow, deliberate wink, a silent boast that he had played the game and won the board. That was the second spike, the audacity of a thief celebrating his heist before the victim's eyes. The ceremony began with agonizing slowness. Emily Thorne floated down the aisle in a cloud of white tulle, her eyes locked on Daniel with the predatory gleam of a woman who had finally secured her meal ticket. The guests leaned in, whispering about the perfect couple and the merger of the century. Amelia moved. She didn't head for a seat. She walked down the side aisle, her footsteps silent on the heavy carpet, until she reached the podium where the officiant stood. The priest paused, his brow furrowing. "Young lady, we haven't reached the—" "I think we should skip to the evidence," Amelia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a crystalline clarity that cut through the violin music. Daniel's smirk flickered. "Amelia, sit down. Don't be a bitter cliché. We talked about this. You're making a scene." "No, Daniel," she replied, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "I'm making a record." She looked toward the back. Cynthia tapped the tablet. The massive projector screens, intended to show a romantic montage of the couple's journey, hummed to life. But there were no photos of sunsets or engagement rings. Instead, a bank statement appeared, magnified until the red numbers were 6 feet tall. The room went silent. It was a vacuum of sound, the kind that precedes a structural collapse. "That's the Sterling Development Fund," Amelia told the room, gesturing to the screen. "Or rather, it's the empty shell of it, and this." She clicked a remote in her hand. Is where the money went. A recording began to play. The audio was crisp, filling the vaulted ceiling. Daniel's voice, arrogant and unfiltered, echoed through the ballroom. The Vance estate is a gold mine. Emily. Once I marry into the land and the trust, I can liquidate the sterling debts before my father even realizes the accounts are bled dry. Amelia is too blinded by legacy to see I'm just using her father's signature to forge the transfer. By the time she wakes up, the house will be mine, and she'll be in a studio apartment wondering where it all went wrong. The silence was broken by a sharp asterisk crack. Eleanor Sterling had dropped her champagne flute. The glass shattered against the marble, the sound like a starter pistol. Amelia turned her gaze to Daniel. The skin around his eyes tightened, then slackened, losing its elasticity as the reality of the public airing hit him. His jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O. The ruddy, self-assured color of his cheeks curdled into a sickly, gray-green hue reminiscent of spoiled milk. A fine sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, catching the light of the chandeliers, while his pupils dilated until his eyes looked like twin pits of ink. He looked less like a groom and more like a man watching his own execution in high definition. His hands, previously steady, began to tremble so violently that he had to grip the altar to remain upright. "Oh, my God," Margaret Vance whispered from the front row, her hand flying to her throat. Robert Vance stood up, his face a mask of cold fury, his large frame casting a long shadow over the Sterling family. "Daniel!" Emily Thorne's voice was a high-pitched squeak. She took a step back, her train snagging on a floral arrangement. "What is this?" "It's the truth, Emily," Amelia said. "But don't worry, you won't have to worry about the Vance land. Because as of 8 o'clock this morning, the Sterling estate, this ballroom, the house you were planning to move into, and the very ground you're standing on belongs to a private holding company." She pulled a single, notarized document from her blazer. The gold seal caught the light. "I bought your debt, Daniel, every cent of it, your father's gambling, your urban planning failures, and the mortgage on the Sterling name. I didn't just protect my father's land, I took yours." Eleanor Sterling lunged forward, her face contorted. "You can't do this. This is a private event. This is our legacy." "Your legacy is a ghost story, Eleanor," Amelia said, not even turning to face her. She looked directly at Daniel, who was now panting, his chest heaving under the weight of his custom suit. "You told me once that I didn't belong in your world, that people like me were just support staff for people like you." Amelia stepped off the dais. She walked toward the exit, the sea of guests parting for her like she was a physical force of nature. She stopped just before the doors and looked back over her shoulder. "You were right, Daniel. I don't belong in your world, I own it. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the estate. I'd start packing the class Eleanor mentioned. I hear it's hard to find in a rental unit." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need to see the Sterling family collapse or hear Emily Thorne's inevitable hysterics. She pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Behind her, the string quartet had stopped playing. The only sound left was the distant, frantic shouting of a man who had finally realized the house was empty. Amelia climbed into the waiting car where her father was already sitting, his hand reaching out to squeeze hers. "Is it done?" he asked. Amelia looked at the St. Regis, the grand facade now nothing more than a beautiful tomb. "The debris is still falling," she said, "but the house is gone." The silence that followed the heavy thud of the ballroom doors was not the peaceful kind. It was the pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Daniel Sterling stood frozen at the center of the parquet floor, his hand still clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne that suddenly looked like a prop from a play that had been canceled mid-performance. Daniel's face didn't just lose color, it seemed to lose its very structure. The arrogance that usually held his features in a mask of superior boredom evaporated, leaving behind a slack, grayish pallor that made him look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung uselessly, his lower lip trembling with a frantic, rhythmic twitch he couldn't control. His eyes, once so cold and calculating, were now wide and bloodshot, darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for a hole that didn't exist. He looked less like a man and more like a ghost that had just realized it was haunting its own funeral. The sweat began to bead at his hairline, carving trails through his expensive foundation, revealing the frantic, hollowed-out version of the man who had spent a decade pretending he was the architect of his own luck. "It's a lie," he whispered, though the words lacked the conviction to even carry across the nearest table. He looked toward his father, but Arthur Sterling had already turned his back, his shoulders slumped as he stared intensely at a landscape painting on the far wall. "Daniel, sit down," Eleanor Sterling commanded, her voice cracking for the first time in her professional life. She was a woman who made her living analyzing the breakdowns of others, yet she looked as though she were watching her own skin peel away. She reached for his arm, her fingers clawing at the sleeve of his bespoke tuxedo, but he wrenched himself away. "She's bluffing," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical register that made the nearest guests flinch. "Amelia doesn't own this. She's a project manager. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment I helped her find. This is some pathetic, elaborate revenge fantasy because I chose Emily." At the mention of her name, Emily Thorne took a deliberate step back. Her eyes weren't filled with the fierce loyalty Daniel expected. Instead, she was looking at him with a cold, analytical detachment, her gaze flickering to the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. A gift Daniel had bought with a credit card that was likely, at this very moment, being incinerated by a legal team. She wasn't seeing her fiancé. She was seeing a sinking ship, and she was already looking for the lifeboats. The guests, the cream of the city's social and political crop, began to shift. The movement was subtle at first, a step back here, a whispered consultation there, but soon it became a physical tide. Margaret Vance stood among them, her face a mask of quiet, regal satisfaction. She didn't say a word. She simply adjusted her pearls and began to walk toward the exit, her husband Robert having already departed to join their daughter. "Margaret," Eleanor called out, her voice desperate. "Surely you don't believe this theater." Margaret paused, her gaze sweeping over the Sterling family with the kind of pity one reserves for a particularly unsightly roadkill. "The theater ended the moment Amelia walked out, Eleanor. Everything else is just the cleaning crew arriving to take out the trash." As Margaret exited, the exodus began in earnest. The string quartet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, packed their instruments in a frantic, percussive clatter of cases and latches. The smell of the expensive lilies that had filled the room now seemed cloying, the scent of a funeral parlor rather than a celebration. Cynthia stepped into the center of the room, flanked by 2 men in charcoal gray suits who carried leather briefcases like weapons. She didn't look like the accommodating wedding planner who had spent months enduring Daniel's condescension. She looked like a woman who had just cashed a very large, very final check. "Mr. Sterling," one of the men said, his voice as dry as parchment, "I am legal counsel for Vance Holdings. We have the original deeds, the transfer of title documents, and the court-ordered eviction notices for the Sterling estate. Since the wedding has been terminated, the grace period for the transition of assets has also expired." "You can't do this," Daniel hissed, his hands balled into fists. "I have rights. I have standing." "You have until noon tomorrow to remove your personal effects from the property," the lawyer continued, unmoved. "Anything remaining after that time, including the vehicles registered to the holding company, will be seized. We have already notified the gate security at the estate. Your biometric access has been revoked." Daniel lunged forward, but the lawyers didn't flinch. They stood their ground with the absolute confidence of men backed by an unbreakable paper trail. "Where is she?" Daniel demanded, spinning around to face the empty space where Amelia had stood. "Where is Amelia?" He didn't wait for an answer. He broke into a run, his dress shoes skidding on the polished marble as he sprinted toward the doors. He burst through them, ignored the startled gasps of the hotel staff in the hallway, and charged toward the grand entrance of the St. Regis. Outside, the morning air was sharp and unforgiving. A black sedan was idling at the curb. Through the tinted glass of the rear window, he could see the silhouette of a woman. Daniel slammed his palms against the glass. Amelia, open this door. You think you can just take everything. You think you can ruin my family and just drive away. The window slid down, but only halfway. Amelia didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked bored. It was the look a homeowner gives to a persistent, annoying insect buzzing against a screen. I didn't take anything, Daniel, she said, her voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. I simply stopped paying for the lie you were living. There's a difference. You used me, he screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. You sat there for 5 years and watched me build my career, watched my mother treat you like a charity case, and you never said a word. You're a sociopath. Amelia leaned forward slightly, the light catching the sharp line of her jaw. I sat there for 5 years and watched you steal from my father's accounts to pay for Emily's jewelry. I watched your mother weaponize her therapy to try and break my spirit so I'd be a more compliant doormat for your ego. I didn't use you, Daniel. I audited you. And the balance came up 0. Robert Vance, sitting in the front seat, turned his head slightly. His eyes were like flint. Step away from the vehicle, son. You're scratching the paint, and I'd hate to add a property damage suit to your growing list of liabilities. Daniel backed away, his chest heaving. He looked up at the facade of the St. Regis, the building he had bragged about managing to his friends, the crown jewel of the life he thought he had secured. It looked cold. It looked like a fortress that had just raised its drawbridge, leaving him outside in the dirt. You'll have nothing, Daniel spat, a final, desperate attempt to wound. No one will marry you now. No one will trust you. You're a shark in a silk dress. Amelia offered a small, thin smile, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because it doesn't need to. You didn't lose everything today, Daniel. You never had it. You were just house-sitting for the person you thought you were better than. I'd suggest you start walking. The car service for the Sterlings has been canceled, and I hear the subway is quite an adjustment for someone of your stature. She tapped the glass, and the window slid up, sealing her back into the quiet, climate-controlled world of the truly powerful. The sedan pulled away from the curb with a smooth, effortless surge of power, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the street. A group of tourists paused on the sidewalk, pointing at the man in the tuxedo standing alone in the gutter. He looked down and realized he was still holding the champagne flute. In his rage, he had squeezed it so hard that the stem had snapped, and a thin line of blood was beginning to drip from his palm onto the white cuff of his shirt. He looked back at the hotel entrance. Emily Thorne was coming out, her coat over her arm, her eyes fixed on a rideshare vehicle pulling up to the curb. She didn't even look in his direction. She stepped into the car and vanished into the city traffic without a backward glance. Daniel was alone. The sun was fully up now, bright and mocking, illuminating the stains on his suit and the emptiness of his future. He reached into his pocket for his phone, his thumb hovering over his mother's contact, but he stopped. He knew exactly what she would say. She would tell him it was his fault for not managing the dynamic better. She would blame him for the loss of the house, the cars, and the reputation. He dropped the broken glass into the gutter. The sound of it shattering against the pavement was small, insignificant, and final. He turned toward the park, the wind catching his hair, and began to walk. He had nowhere to go, no one to call, and for the first time in his life, no one was coming to save him. Behind him, the St. Regis stood tall and indifferent, already preparing for the next guest, the next event, and the next person who would mistake its hospitality for ownership. 6 months later, the dust from the Sterling Vance collapse had finally settled, though the air in Amelia's new penthouse office still smelled faintly of fresh white paint and expensive cedarwood. It was a sterile, clean scent, a sharp contrast to the suffocating floral perfume and stale champagne that had defined her previous life. Amelia Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers tracing the cool, polished edge of a marble coaster. Below, the city moved in a rhythmic, indifferent crawl, a sea of yellow cabs and scurrying shadows that cared nothing for the private wars won and lost in the high-rises above. She took a slow sip of espresso, the bitterness grounding her. On her desk lay the final quarterly report for Vance Developments. The numbers were staggering. By reclaiming her grandfather's trust and liquidating the assets Daniel had tried to siphon, she hadn't just survived, she had ascended. She was no longer the quiet project manager hiding behind a modest title. She was the architect of her own empire. The door chimes signaled a visitor. Cynthia stepped in, looking radiant in a sharp, cobalt blue power suit. She carried a slim leather folder and a look of quiet satisfaction that mirrored Amelia's own. Final permits for the Riverside project were approved this morning, Cynthia said, her voice echoing slightly in the minimalist space. She set the folder down and leaned against the mahogany desk. But that's not why I'm here. I thought you might want to see the latest update from the municipal planning office. Amelia didn't turn around. Did they finish the audit? They did. And since the Sterling name is now synonymous with fiduciary negligence, the city council stripped Daniel of his licensing. He's barred from lead consultancy for the next 10 years. Cynthia paused, her smile widening. He's currently working as a junior clerk in the records department. Level 1, entry-level salary. Amelia felt a brief, cold flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't the fiery rage she had carried through the wedding preparations, but something more clinical. Justice, she realized, didn't always feel like a victory. Sometimes it just felt like the world returning to its proper axis. Has he tried to contact the firm? Amelia asked. Every week. He sends these long, rambling emails to HR, using all that therapeutic jargon his mother taught him. He talks about healing the professional rift and restorative collaboration. The interns use them for entertainment during lunch breaks. Amelia finally turned, the sunlight catching the sharp line of her jaw. And a leaner. Cynthia's expression softened into something resembling pity. She had to sell the estate in Greenwich to cover the legal fees from the fraud investigation. She's living in a 2-bedroom condo in White Plains. Word is she's tried to restart her private practice, but no one wants a therapist whose own son is a convicted embezzler. The Sterling legacy didn't just crumble, Amelia. It evaporated. The wait for it moment arrived an hour later when Amelia had to visit the very municipal building where Daniel now spent his days. She didn't have to go, she could have sent an assistant, but she needed to see the finality of it. She needed the sensory anchor of his defeat to fully close the chapter. The municipal building smelled of floor wax and desperation. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly green hue on the rows of cramped cubicles. Amelia moved through the space like a ghost from a world they could no longer afford. Her silk trench coat whispered against her legs, a sound of luxury that felt violent in such a drab setting. She found him at a desk near the back, wedged between a leaking water cooler and a stack of yellowing archives. Daniel Sterling looked smaller than she remembered. The arrogant tilt of his head was gone, replaced by a defeated slouch. His suit, once a bespoke Italian masterpiece, was frayed at the cuffs and bore a faint, persistent stain near the lapel. He was squinting at a computer screen, his fingers hovering over a keyboard that looked sticky with age. When he looked up and saw her, the transformation was instantaneous. For a split second, the old Daniel flickered to life, the predator who thought he could charm his way out of a cage. He stood up too quickly, knocking a stack of papers to the floor. "Amelia," he breathed, his voice cracking. He stepped out of the cubicle, ignoring the annoyed glance of a coworker. "I knew you'd come. I've been waiting for the right moment to reach out. Everything that happened, it was a systemic breakdown. We were both victims of a high-stress environment. If we could just sit down, maybe at that bistro we used to love, we could navigate a path forward." Amelia watched him, her eyes as vacant as a winter sky. The rage spike she expected didn't come. Instead, she felt a profound sense of boredom. This was the man she had almost tied her life to, a man who, even in the gutter, still thought he was the protagonist of a tragedy rather than the villain of a farce. "I'm here to sign the deed transfers for the Riverside lot, Daniel," she said, her voice low and even. "I'm not here for a path forward. There is no path for you that involves me." "Don't be like that," he said, reaching out as if to touch her arm. She stepped back, the movement so fluid and dismissive it was as if he were a leper. His hand hung in the air, trembling. My mother is depressed, Amelia. My career is in ruins. Don't you think I've paid enough? A little professional courtesy, a recommendation to a private firm could change everything. You have the power now. Use it to be the bigger person. I am being the bigger person, Amelia replied. She leaned in slightly, the scent of her expensive, citrusy perfume cutting through the smell of his cheap coffee and failure. The bigger person would have let you go to prison. I just let you become who you actually are. A clerk. A footnote. A man who counts other people's money because he couldn't keep his hands off mine. She watched his face collapse. It wasn't the dramatic, public shattering of the St. Regis, but a slow, agonizing realization. The skin around his eyes puckered, and his mouth thinned into a line of pure, impotent resentment. He looked at her silk coat, her polished shoes, and the diamond studs in her ears. The secret power of her independence made manifest, and he finally understood that he was invisible to her. "You're cold," he hissed, the entitlement finally curdling into spite. "You were always cold. You trapped me." "No, Daniel," she said, turning toward the exit. "I just stopped warming you with my own fire. Good luck with the filing. I hear the 2018 records are particularly messy." She walked away, the click of her heels on the linoleum sounding like a countdown reaching 0. She didn't look back. Later that evening, Amelia sat on the terrace of her loft, the cooling air of autumn nipping at her skin. Her father, Robert Vance, sat in the chair across from her. He looked tired. The war had taken its toll on him, too. The legal battles and the public scandal had added lines to his face that no amount of victory could erase. He held a glass of scotch, staring out at the horizon. "It's done then?" he asked quietly. "It's done, Dad," she said. "And was it worth it?" Amelia looked at her hands. They were steady, but they felt different. Older. The cost of her justice wasn't just the money or the time. It was the loss of the girl who had believed that love was a sanctuary. She had traded her innocence for an empire, and while the empire was magnificent, the silence in the loft was heavy. She thought of the years she had spent dimming her own light so Daniel wouldn't feel overshadowed. She thought of the trust she had offered Alina, only to have it weaponized against her. "Yes," Amelia said, though her voice held a hint of a shadow. "It was worth it, but I think I'm done building things for a while. I just want to live in what's left." The final image of the day stayed with her as she watched the sun dip below the skyline. She saw the city lights flicker on, one by one, illuminating the path she had carved through the wreckage of her past. She was a woman who owned her name, her fortune, and her future. But as she looked down at the street level, where the shadows were longest, she saw a lone figure emerging from the subway, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, disappearing into the crowd of nobodies. Amelia stepped back inside and closed the glass door, the seal clicking shut with a sound of absolute, final security. The view from the loft was perfect, but for the first time, she realized how high up she truly was, and how far the fall had been for everyone else.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.